Uh, One of the key things is to keep reminding oneself that when we talk about blanket labels, say cerebral palsy or heart disease or tummy ache or whatever, we're really using this as a headline, and underneath this may be whole rows of problems. And cerebral palsy is an example. It's a condition that acquired its name I think in the 19th century. And Sigmund Freud, the great psychoanalyst and so on, wrote a lot about it in about 1890, and gradually sort of interest emerged. But I think it was only really in the 1940s, 1950s, that any sort of sense was put into this. So message one, cerebral palsy is just a headline for a number of brain-associated problems. The thing about these problems are that they are baby problems. Most of them have started before the baby was born. And it gets very difficult to know quite why some children survive most appallingly difficult obstetric history and difficult births and are perfectly all right. And yet there are other children who seem to have, nobody was terribly worried about them in utero, and yet end up with this problem. Of course, it's become much easier to sort out what the brain looks like ever since CT and ultrasound and then MRI scan were invented. So we're more able to say why a child has developed some nasty neurological disorder. And one of the great difficulties is deciding when a child has neurological symptoms, you know, the cerebral baby, the baby who won't feed, the baby who's stiff, the baby who's having fits. Really, what is going on? How should we treat them at this stage? And what prognosis should we give? Because sometimes babies' neurological problems are very difficult to diagnose in the early stage. We may get over-worried in one case, and in another case, miss it all. So I just sort of make this as introductory remarks. What I've done, just to try and make things simple, I think this is a rather marvellous little book, which is quite sort of light for people's pockets, and I think there ought to be one around in any office where children's services run, and bits that one can photocopy. I warn you against getting too much advice on the internet. A book like this is edited, and it's been through a whole lot of set of eyes before it actually gets published. Something that's put on the internet may be written by great authorities or by complete nutcases. And, you know, if you were to look up cerebral palsy, you'd get a mixture of advertisements for cures in inverted commas, double inverted commas, or you may get, in general, if you're looking at websites, if they come from a good American hospital in particular, I find they usually, or an Australian one, the health service also has its own websites, often actually cribbed straight from the American ones, but are worth looking at. But there's an awful lot of stuff that's not worth looking at. Can I pass this book round? But as I paid for it from my own money, can I have it back afterwards? The little ribbon is in there. It just gives, I've taken definitions and stuff from it because there are so many different accounts and versions of things around. So if I tried to take every point of view, we'd never get anywhere. This is a list of things I was thinking I'd talk about this morning. I'm getting more interested in things like wheelchairs because nobody else seems to be really interested in them. And actually, let me, how many of you have got one of these? A very important medical instrument if you are dealing with children with disabilities. This is Halford's tire pressure gauge, which, because it's found about half the children in wheelchairs, our tires are inflated to the wrong pressure, and you may know from your own cars that if your tire pressure is wrong, you may be using far more petrol or far more energy to push your chair than if they're the right place. Also, I hope you take your cars for shed servicing. An awful lot of wheelchairs are not taken for servicing, and they should. They need oil in the right places and the right grease. And also, of course, cars don't grow, wheelchairs don't grow, children with any luck do grow, and constant refitting. I was going to say this at the end of the lecture, but I think I said at the beginning, while the coffee is still having effects on you, cerebrally rather than further down. In a population, what we used to talk about health districts, which are about 250,000, well, that seems to have gone now, but if you think of a town of 250,000 people, say half of Bristol, or towns of Plymouth, and so on, 250,000 people, and you get this number of children, which about 4,000 have something wrong with them, that for a whole variety of reasons. When you really boil this down, you'll find in this hypothetical town, there are about 50 who will have a diagnosis of cerebral palsy. So there's not really very many compared to the great multitude of children. But they can take up, one child with cerebral palsy can take up the amount of medical and nursing time that perhaps 100 other children would need in a year. So, as I've said, in that town, there'll be about 130 children of this age who have a wheelchair, but of those, about 50 have cerebral palsy. Now, the thing, of course, about cerebral palsies are that they are of all degrees of severity. The typical child that you see with cerebral palsy makes an impact on us, of course, is the one in the wheelchair, the one with very severe problems. And that is rather the image that cerebral palsy gets. But we have to remember that there are a lot of children with mild degrees. And I don't know, I walk around the street, I forever seeing people with mild degrees of cerebral palsy. Walking from my house to the underground, I saw a chap of about 40 sitting in some sort of appalling sort of crate with wheels on, I think to be collected by the local van that takes people to the day centre. But what sort of chair was it? I mean, I cannot imagine. I mean, it looked appalling, and he was sitting out there in the cold, waiting for the van to come. And it just sort of made me, think of some of the unresolved needs. He should not be sitting in the cold. I mean, all of us don't like being in the cold, but having cerebral palsied limbs is doubly bad because our muscles get stiff. Our chest movements are not as good as other people, much more likely to get chest infections and so on. So just homely lessons for my walk to the underground. We can't really, when we're thinking about neurological disabilities in babies, we realize there is a vast spectrum of problems that we've got to sort out. Only some of the children with neurological problems actually have cerebral palsy. So to start with, we've really got to think about every possible reason and diagnosis and hone it down. And also, of course, our whole drive in health must be prevention. Can we stop children getting neurological problems and other diseases? And I just put these up, few little headlines. Realizing that the pattern of disability in children is changing. On the one hand, we are very much better at preventing a whole lot of conditions, phenylketonuria and hypothyroidism, and all these conditions that used to be quite common, mercifully, we're able to pick them up early and put in preventive treatments, right diets, and so on. The problem is being replaced by this. As obstetric services get better, in inverted commas, population is much more sensitive to poor services in the past, but on the other hand, there's more tiny babies survive. There was a time when, in my own lifetime, when really a baby under 1,000 grams at birth was pretty unlikely to survive. What's the British record for lowest birth weight baby that survived? Any offers? I may not be completely up to date, but you're getting around the sort of 300 gram size. Some of these babies didn't grow properly in utero. Some were very short gestations indeed, but there's a great law of diminishing returns, and these very short miracle babies who survive have an enormously high risk, of course, of brain abnormality. The brain of these very small babies, particularly the very early prems, are very soft. They bleed into their brains very easily. They are very sensitive to temperature changes and so on. So these are the babies, the new babies, that didn't exist 40 years ago. And now they are among the children with cerebral palsy we have to be ready for. A new sort of baby. All sorts of other things I've written there. You know how we all must be banging on about own goals of alcohol, tobacco, strange drugs, and so on. And we know so much more about chromosomes, and there's genetics, and there's going to be lots and lots more to learn in the coming years. And of course, this very vexed area that gets a lot of publicity about babies where there's allegations against the obstetric, the delivery, whether this child's cerebral palsy was due to some obstetric failure and missed a fetal heart fall off, or whether this was part of a natural progression in a baby who was doomed. £1 million lawsuits can be taken over this. I must extremely quickly go over just a reminder about the grammar of the whole subject of young children, and that is about development. There's no hope of my doing more than just reminding you that every time we see a young baby, we need to see that baby afresh. The old complaint is, I took the baby to the clinic. It was very cold, so they didn't sort of look at the baby, and you find this baby was examined with a shawl and a baby grow and a padded jacket and a few other things, and vital signs. And the thing I have to say is, if the place is not warm enough, get it warmed and go on warpath against the administration that won't let you heat the clinic properly so you can look at that baby, because you'll learn so much more seeing the undressed baby and knowing about child development and what is right at what stage. And I'll just have to whiz through these, just a few, I press the wrong button. To have the right equipment, and to look, we do have the whole time to look at the whole baby and see, are they doing as other babies are doing? And also to make certain this is recorded in the green or the yellow or the red or whichever book your locality uses, and make sure every time you see the child you write something in it. And if the book hasn't been brought, you give whatever appropriate rocket is right in the situation. You need to see this book. The dog ate it. Well, let's get you another book, but make sure it is brought next time. I see too many books with clean white pages. Nobody has ever looked or written in them. It's ridiculous. And just the things you all know what children should do at such ages. So I'll talk all this. Just remember some groups of babies develop at different rates than others. And I was once sent a baby at age 6 months who was a bit stiff. What was wrong with him? There wasn't anything wrong with him at all. He was a Nigerian baby who, from a part of Nigeria where babies developed faster than many other places. I mean, and one just has to know what are the sort of different patterns. This baby hadn't got anything wrong at all. But I was rather proud to be able to see this child and just do a little teaching around this. And then other things we've got to keep thinking about this the whole time is if this child is not doing things, what's wrong? I mean, I've seen so many cases where hip problems, muscular dystrophies and so on, let alone cerebral palsy, have just not been picked up. So any doubt, try and find, it's part of your stock in trade to know where you should get a second opinion from, whose second opinions are useful and whose are useless. And if you don't know, you've just got to find what is the right path for where you're working. So we must really think about cerebral palsy plural. We talk about cerebral palsies, not just a single condition, but it's a headline word for a number of different disorders. Now, how many children have a form of cerebral palsy? Your different books will give you different rates, and from different countries you'll get different experiences. But if you say 1 in 2,000, well, if you work in an area where the maternity unit delivers, say, 4,000 babies a year, you might only get 2 children with really quite genuine cerebral palsy. So you think, why am I bothering to talk to you about something that's really pretty rare? But rarities crop up. We all see rare conditions as well as common. The important thing is to remember that in cerebral palsies are a problem for little people. If any of us meet some nasty neurological problem, we might get a stroke. But really, in little babies, different patterns of brain disorder. And this is just a rough guide to the main sorts of cerebral palsy. And you'll see these Greek words of hemiplegia and diplegia and so on. It took me a long time to understand really what they meant. I'm not absolutely sure that I know now, but these words are bandied around. So if you've got a hemi something, you've got half. It might be your top half or one side. And the idea of a condition being spastic is, of course, tight. Your muscles are tight, and some muscle groups are stronger than others, and it may deform your position. So your hands go into this sort of shape. Your knees may become tight, and you can't straighten them. This is all to muscle groups controlled by the brain due to lesions in the head. The rarer form of cerebral palsy, of course, is where all limbs, and not just limbs, gut and funny little muscles all over the place, being affected. So your speech is affected, your swallowing is affected, and so on. So many different sorts. And somebody has got to make this right. There is a rare form of cerebral palsy which you're not so much stiff as you make sort of odd movements and writhing movements, which is really pretty obvious. Some of you may have seen a film with St. Daniel Day-Lewis in. You may have seen him as Lincoln. Earlier you saw him as a boy with severe cerebral palsy, who could write with his left foot only. A pretty accurate portrayal, actually. And then there are some very rare forms of cerebral palsy. I hardly dare mention them but just occasionally you get cerebral palsies coupled with very severe epilepsy, very severe problems, and they need to be especially thought about, right? So often the cause of cerebral palsy is multiple. There are several things that have gone wrong together. The history of the pregnancy, the history of the babies from birth onward needs to be known, and really they've got to be seen by people who know what they're talking about. And this can be difficult, particularly in rural areas where maybe in Britain most places have got some service, but enough places where it's a day's bus ride to get to any major centre. And of course the role of our magic head scanners, which now the whole population knows about, loves them, and thinks they can tell all the answers. These things are only as good as the machine on which they're done, the person who takes the picture and looks at them. And so it's not a sort of universal thing. If you say you've had an MRI scan, I'd like to know whether it's done by a mobile van where the reports are read in China, which is happening at times, or whether it's done by somewhere that we can know about. So a lot of preventable factors, and there's no time to go into them in detail. And nearly all cerebral palsy has occurred in children in their first 28 days of life. Most of the causes after that, not many have a cause after that. One of the key things is to looking after these children, one, to get them fed properly. If you are difficult to feed, if you're regurgitating all the time, if it takes an hour and a half to get your feed in, you're just not going to get the necessary nutrition you need. A lot of the babies with severe cerebral palsy get very thin as a result. Other children, particularly those with ataxia, making gross muscle movements the whole time, are sort of competing in the Olympic Games all day with the amount of energy expenditure. And this comes to this very vexed question as how do you get the food in? Should they have a gastrostomy and just bypass the whole swallowing mechanism? Very scary for parents. I've come across parents who absolutely refuse to have this done, and yet there's these poor children getting thinner and thinner. Sometimes even you've got to poke the tube in even further into the jejunum rather than just the gastrostomy. This is a subject for high-powered children's hospitals with high-powered dietitians, high-powered surgeons, but it's just to realize that nutritional problems, if a child keeps regurgitating, takes an hour and a half to feed, they've got to have proper advice. And there are all sorts of deficiency diseases that they can get so readily. A very fashionable treatment for people of my age and younger is to have injections of botulinum, and otherwise known as Botox. The same stuff can be used to relax muscles in children with cerebral palsy. It became highly fashionable a few years ago as a bit of a cure, but there's never a cure. if you inject this stuff into muscle groups, it will last a few weeks. If you keep doing it, children get antibodies to it. I'm not an enthusiast for this, but there are those who are. That's all we can say. A whole row of additional problems one's got to be thinking about, as well as feeding problems, bone and joint problems, hip dislocations. All the children, virtually, who've got severe cerebral palsy get dislocated hips unless you can take early preventive measures. And this means a great deal of skilled physiotherapy. So the physiotherapist is absolutely vital that they get to see these children early before problems of this sort occur. Chest infections are a real killer of children with cerebral palsy. Many get epilepsy. Another big problem is dribbling or drooling. And there are ways, there are sticky patches with scopolamine you can put on the child to try and get them to absorb this sort of slowly. But again, if a child keeps dribbling, it's got to be looked after properly. Absolutely curse otherwise. We all make an enormous amount of saliva each day, which we don't know about, but I can't remember, is it 2 litres a day or something like this? It's some vast quantity, and if it all came out the side of our face and onto our bib, you'd really know it. Intellectual problems. Some children with cerebral palsy are just as clever as anybody else. But there are some, if they've got horrible holes in their brain substance, are intellectually retarded and often associated that with behavior problems. For a long time, I worked with a charity called Whiz Kids, which was involved in trying to improve a pressure group for better equipment for children with cerebral palsies. The old problems of long waits, only a limited range of equipment available via HM government. Then you see somebody in a bright blue and red wheelchair with all sorts of gadgets. And of course, parents are going to want this, not the government's black, horrible thing, we wait a year for and it's too small. I mean, things mercifully have improved, but a lot of pressure has been needed here. So I just say you must be, if you're involved, whatever job you do, if you see a child coming with equipment, see, is this equipment any good? Is it any real use? Or do the parents just accept it and then put it in the garage or out in outside the front door of their flat because they haven't got room for it indoors and never use it? All sorts of things get demanded. So if it's going to be a hoist, it must be one that's useful, otherwise it's a menace. The proper, appropriate cars. I've seen people who've been given a major legal settlement, gone off and bought an Audi Q7. Do you know what an Audi Q7 is? It's one of these enormous things that blocks the road. Quite difficult to get a child into. What they probably need is a converted van, which can slide a child in with a wheelchair. All there's got to be a lot of sense over this. In houses, that the doors are wide enough. It's not terribly difficult to widen a door usually, and so on. But having a disabled child is very expensive. A lot of divorces among parents with disabled children, and dad takes a job that he stops being a long-distance lorry driver and becomes a van driver around the local streets at a quarter of the pay. Just a quick word, sorry, my time is up, but I just want to say, be very, very chary about unorthodox treatments. Because any physical condition that has can have a poor prognosis, a difficult life course, and if somebody out there, usually in America, or it might be Russia, has some wonderful new treatment, it's got to be good. And you'll see I went to Hungary to see the original P2 clinic. The thing in Hungary is, and this was in the communist times in particular, when you paid your staff very little, expected them to work 24 hours a day, and you were prepared to give them a 5-year training, you could get a person called a conductor, who was a wonderful, multi-skilled therapist. I'm afraid Britain it doesn't provide enough saints to do this. So we really, our whole objective must be to improve the conditions we've got, work through the systems we have, to encourage interdisciplinary working through child development centres, so people don't have to go to one place in the morning and somewhere else in the afternoon and somewhere else next week. If they can all work together as a team, you can get vastly better results. So discourage unorthodoxy. Right, I think the important thing is that they get to a child development centre. In this world of cuts and so on, you have to fight for your child development centre and get people working together. That is the secret. And the other thing is to measure children, because you'll probably go to a lecture by a chap called Tam Fry, who will tell you all off for bad, terrible work. I don't tell people off at all, but I do encourage measurement, watching, weighing, measuring the size of the child's head, and also trying to keep continuity so that the parents with affected children get as much possible support as they can.